Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, and I guess especially thank you for mentioning the books. I have 3 kids in college, so anytime somebody promotes my books, I'm very happy about that. It's truly an honor to be here. When I was in the airport in Amsterdam on the way here yesterday, a friend of mine asked where I was going. I said, I'm going to Oslo. And he said, oh, Nobel Peace Prize. And I said, no, I'm not getting the Nobel Peace Prize. Far better than that, I'm going to get to address an audience of people who have committed their lives to helping youth. And as far as I'm concerned, that's far more noble than that geopolitical stuff that wins you the Nobel Peace Prize. I want to apologize for my voice. I've been battling a cold and laryngitis for more than a week. I knew it was going to be painful for you, but after listening to the beautiful music that the youth put on, I'm going to look really bad by comparison. I apologize. So I'm going to try to talk some about what the trends in North America have been during this period of liberalization in terms of the prevalence of use, the intensity of use, and use by youth. And I know I won't get through all these slides. There's so much to talk about, and a lot of this I have to credit my colleagues on those books and other. Before I launch into the information about the use, just a couple words about the policy context. The point of this slide is just that policy has evolved over time. One of the big myths of legalization is that it is like a light switch. The myth is it is something that is either there or not. But instead, policy has evolved gradually over time, and there are many different forms of legalization. The kind that is happening in North America is commercial legalization with a for-profit industry. And I want you to keep that in mind. In fact, you could ask, why do you care at all about what's happening in North America? Because the policy debate here is so different. One answer is that it is sometimes hard to stop when you start a policy reform movement. The United States did decriminalization in the 1970s, and it did not have big effects on use then, but it started a dialogue that has evolved past then, since. And the second is that your youth are going to live in an international culture that has a cannabis industry that is active. We know that for-profit industries pay Hollywood movie producers to feature their brands in the plot lines of movies. I think you should expect that to happen with cannabis brands within the next decade as well. So what happens in one part of the world spills over to another, and I want to tell you a little bit about what's been happening in the United States and Canada. The second big myth about legalization or policy reform more generally is that it doesn't matter, that it doesn't affect use. And that's just wrong. So this graph shows the number of cannabis users in the United States. On the far left, it's at the end of that first period of liberalization during the 1970s. Then we had 12 years of conservative policy under the Reagan-Bush era from 80 to 92, and the number of users went way down. And now it's gone back up again in association with the liberalization. So policy moves in sync with changes in patterns of use. But one of my important messages for you is that it is not primarily about the number of users, it's about the intensity of use. That's the big change that really matters. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a series of slides that show trend over time, starting in 1992 up through the present, for 4 different measures of use. So this is just the total number of people who have used in the last year. It's more than doubled, but that's not a very big increase compared to the number of quote-unquote current users, meaning people who have used in the last month. That has more than tripled. But if we factor in frequency of use, meaning the number of days of use, then the increase is by a factor of 6. And what we care about most is the number of people who use daily or near daily, and that has increased 11-fold. Back in 1992, it was 0.9 million. Now it is over 10 million people who are using daily or near daily. And that's because the change isn't just a change in the number of users, it's a change in the position of the product within society and the social constructs around use. Back in 1992, marijuana, cannabis, was a recreational drug, something people did for fun, mostly on weekends. This graph shows the proportion of current users who use daily or near daily. The bottom line is for alcohol, and you can see that for most people who use alcohol in the United States, it is sort of a weekend thing. It's something done for fun, not a daily habit. A generation ago, cannabis was like that, but it isn't anymore. Now more than a third of cannabis users use it daily. It's integrated into daily life. The use patterns are a lot more like tobacco. And if instead of looking at it as proportions, we just look at the absolute number, top line is alcohol, bottom line is cannabis. Simple number of people using daily or near daily. So a generation ago in the United States, if you were thinking about daily and near daily use, it was all about alcohol. Like the deputy minister was saying, that was the central issue. That is no longer the case. Now, for every 3 people using alcohol daily or near daily in the United States, there are 2 people who are using cannabis daily or near daily. And that means when you think about cannabis use today, you have to think about daily and near daily use. This is my best slide for capturing it. I apologize, it's complicated. I promise this is the last really hard slide. But I'm a professor and I have to do at least one of these every time I talk. So there are 4 bars corresponding to different measures of use. The bottom part in black corresponds to daily and near daily. On the far left, it's the number of people who have used in the last year. Daily and near daily users are only about 1 in 5 people who have used cannabis within the last year. If you move over 1 bar, then it's current use, it grows to a third. If you move over another bar, it's days of use. And these small number of people who use daily or near daily account for 2/3 of the days of use. But they also use more grams per day of use. So the bar on the far right is the quantity consumed. They are 80% of the market. So 80% of the profits of the industry come from the daily or near daily users. Yet another way to look at this is just what is the market? And I often set this up by asking, what proportion of the market do you think is adults who have no substance use disorder and who use only on weekends? That part of the market, that sort of controlled market we don't worry much about, is less than 3% of the sales. The industry doesn't care about that. Their money comes from daily and near daily users, which are the 2 big wedges. The wedge on the right is people who have a substance use disorder. The people on the left are people who use daily and near daily but don't report a substance use disorder. But it is daily and near daily use that dominates. All right, so that's my message number 1. When policy changes, use changes, but you cannot track that only in terms of number of users. The big change and the concerning issue is in the frequency of use and also intensity. So what are people getting per day? And that's what I want to talk about next, is changes over time in how much gets used on a given day of use. Part of this story is a change in potency. The products are far more potent than they used to be. I'm not going to walk you through this slide because I know Tom is going to talk about potency and he'll do a much better job than I can. But the short punchline is before 2000, the average potency of the cannabis that was seized never even reached 5%. Now the average potency of flower products sold in the state licensed stores is over 20%, and more than a third of the product sales are other kinds of products like vaping oils and dabs where the potency is 60 and 70 or more percent. So potency has gone way up. But I want to contrast what I think was the typical pattern of use, or what we think of from the last century. And that is somebody who has maybe one joint per weekend night, either by themselves or they share 2 joints with a friend. Those joints were about half a gram. The potency was about 4%. If you multiply, I won't ask you to do it. It's early in the morning. Trust me, I did the arithmetic right. That's about 5 milligrams of THC per day on average. What is it today now that 80% of the market is people who are using daily or near daily? Those people are consuming about 1.5 grams per day of material that is 20% THC. So they are averaging about 300 milligrams per day, or about 65 times the daily dose. So we know that the pattern of use from the last century did not cause a lot of health harms. We don't know yet whether the pattern of use that dominates the market today does cause many health harms. Maybe it's not a big issue because the human body has a remarkable capacity for tolerance and to adapt to a greater dose. On the other hand, sometimes the dose makes the poison. I do not know whether or not this new pattern of use is something that should be concerning, but when I speak, my main message is just a caution that legalization, especially with a commercial industry, takes the world into a place that it has never been before. So let me try to make that point by reference to my vice. Oh no, first I'm going to talk about this with cocaine. So this is sort of a spooky parallel. For 1,000 years, people in the Andean region of South America have used the coca bush to make tea that operates in that society very much the way coffee does here. And it turns out that when you brew tea from coca leaves, you get about 5 milligrams of cocaine, about the same number of milligrams as the old pattern of cannabis use. I was part of a study in the United States where we estimated total cocaine consumption, and we can divide that by the number of chronic users. It's a terrible term, I apologize for it, but it's the US government term for essentially high-frequency users. And when you do the division, they turn out to consume also about 300 milligrams of cocaine per day. In other words, again, about 65 or 70 times as much. And we know that the top pattern of consumption does not cause health harms. The bottom pattern of consumption, heavy cocaine users in the United States, are having their lives very seriously adversely affected by that use. And now let me try to put it in the context of my own vice, which is Diet Coke. And usually my slide at this point talks about a 20-ounce bottle of Diet Coke. And Steve Garrick warned me that this is a modern society, so you don't know what ounces are. So on the slide it talks about 0.6 liters, but I also brought along my own bottle to show you this is my vice. Every day I consume one of these, and that has about 76 milligrams of caffeine. What would it mean for me to increase my dose of caffeine by the same amount that the dose of THC has been increasing in North America? And the answer is I would need to go to Starbucks and order 33 grande cappuccinos every single day to match the increase in dose of caffeine that's proportional to the change in dose of THC in the market. And sometimes the dose does matter. And it's not just because it's a dependence-inducing intoxicant. If I drink half a cup of water, I'm happy. But there's this horrible case of a woman who had a water compulsion. One day she drank 30 or 40 glasses of water. The dose 60 or 70 times more, and it killed her. She actually died of fatal water intoxication. My daughter knows that I like blueberries. This is a dose of blueberries that makes me happy, but she wanted you to see what it looks like to have a dose of blueberries that is 65 times larger. And if I consumed that, I would probably have a stomachache. So sometimes the dose matters, and this dose that is now typical in North American cannabis markets takes us to a place that we just don't know the health consequences. So this is a graph from a famous study of cannabis. Basically, we randomized in the laboratory some people to get cannabis, some people to get placebo. The line that stays flat is the people who got placebo. The 3 lines that jump up are the people who got cannabis. The line that comes down very quickly is THC in blood. The 2 lines that stay high are sense of intoxication and impairment. And the main usual point of showing this slide is to show that there's a very low correlation between THC in blood and impairment, because most of the impairment comes from the metabolic byproducts, and the way that THC is metabolized in the body is much more complicated than for alcohol. So when you read a low correlation between THC in blood and traffic accidents, that should not surprise you, because there's not even a high correlation between THC in blood and impairment. So that's the usual way this slide is briefed, but the point I want to make now is that in this laboratory study, the dose they used was only 43 milligrams, nothing close to 300 milligrams. Here's another classic study. In the laboratory, we give some people a placebo, other groups get increasing doses of cannabis, and we look at how well they're able to stay in a lane in a computerized simulator of driving. The really scary thing about this study to me is if you look at the line for placebo, they only stayed in their lane 90% of the time. The folks who got cannabis did less well, and there's a dose-response relationship. By the time you get to the highest dose of cannabis, they were staying in their lane only half of the time. That highest dose of cannabis was 46 milligrams, not 300 milligrams. And this is not just from selective studies. There's a literature review that just came out that looked across the entire literature trying to understand the cardiovascular effects of cannabis. And across all 14 high-quality studies, the doses ranged from 14 to 35 milligrams. The point is, we just don't know. We do not have a scientific literature measuring the health consequences of doses of THC of the sort that are now the norm in a continent that has liberalized policy to the extent that we have. Now, there's a lot of interest in cannabis risk compared to alcohol risk, because we're so much more familiar with alcohol. And Steve Garrick wanted me to talk a little bit about one study I did about that. And I want to say that the risks are entirely different. All right, so alcohol has the risk of suppressing prefrontal cortex, making one impulsive, which is why it can contribute to violence, for instance. And part of the mechanism for alcohol and bad driving is people becoming overconfident and aggressive. Those are just not consequences of THC intoxication. On the other hand, there are other kinds of consequences associated with THC intoxication, such as lack of focus or ability to sustain attention. And when you study driving accidents, you find out that a lot of accidents stem from an inability to stay focused on task. So it's sometimes hard to do a one-for-one comparison and say which is more dangerous, but we can at least do this. We can go to the surveys that ask, has this drug caused this particular problem in your life? Has it interfered with your work? Has it interfered with school? Has it interfered with social relationships? And we can ask for what proportion of current users of alcohol do they say, yes, alcohol is interfering with my ability to get things done. And we can do the same thing for cannabis, for what proportion of current cannabis users. Now, in absolute numbers, alcohol causes more problems because there's still more alcohol use. But we can look at those two proportions and look at the ratio of those two proportions and see which one is larger. And that was the point of the study, and it produces this very complicated table. You do not need to pay a lot of attention to it, but every one of the rows corresponds to one of these questions about, is the substance having this effect on you? So at the very top, it's, did you need more to achieve the same effect? In the middle, you have questions like, did you try to cut down but fail? And at the bottom, there are things like, did it put you in physical danger? In the far right-hand column is this ratio of ratios. So when the ratio of ratios is 1, it means the same proportion of cannabis users as alcohol users reported this problem. When the number is bigger than 1, it means a larger proportion of cannabis users reported the problem. And when it's smaller than 1, the proportion was larger for alcohol. And the basic punchline of this slide is that the only outcome in the survey for which alcohol had a lower proportion of current users reporting the difficulty was on the physical side. But for the behavioral effects, the ability to perform, cannabis was often the bigger one in terms of proportion. And at some level, I don't think this should be terribly surprising because cannabis is not known as a performance enhancer of cognitive functioning. So I have 3 kids, and I like to tell stories about the 3 kids. My daughter, who's very adventuresome, likes to do pole vaulting in track and field. And if she goes to a track and field meet, it's entirely reasonable for the coach of the other team to want to have her tested to see if she used steroids, because steroids genuinely improve performance at physical activities. My oldest son competed in chess. My second son competed in debate. Never once in all those chess competitions, in all those debate competitions, did the opposing coaches insist that my sons get tested to see whether or not their coach was slipping them performance-enhancing cannabis, to see if that cannabis was going to help them think more moves ahead in the chess game, or to be able to make their points in debate more concisely. Cannabis is just not a performance-enhancing drug in a world that is about knowledge processing, like the modern economy. Okay, I have only a little bit of time left. I want to try to get to the third part of the talk, which is what has been going on with kids, because I know that's something that is particularly of interest in this audience. And the short answer is that the kids are doing all right in the United States, despite all of these policy changes, at least superficially. So this is just a graph of the proportion of 12th graders who self-report cannabis use, and it's been stable despite all of the changes in cannabis perceptions of harm, despite the changes in policy, despite the changes in potency. But I don't know whether or not we should conclude from that policy does not affect kids. Because if I look at the other 2 drugs that are important in kids' lives, alcohol and tobacco, use has been going way down, dramatically down. Tobacco use has gone from 30% to below 10%. If I take the graph back a little bit for alcohol, it used to be that 70% of American kids had used alcohol in the last month, and that's down below 1/3. And it's not just alcohol and tobacco use. If I put any indicator you want up on the graph and look at the trend over time, you would see that the trends are enormously favorable for American youth. This happens to be driving under the influence. This is the graph for precocious sexual activity. This is the graph for serious crime. This is the graph for minor crime. In every single life indicator that we care about, the trends are enormously favorable for youth over the last generation, with the sole exception of cannabis use, which has been flat. So I think perhaps the question is not so much why didn't liberalization of policy push down cannabis use amongst youth, but rather why didn't cannabis use drop the same way that all of the other adverse indicators have dropped over the last generation? And so the answer may be that the policy reforms canceled out progress that we otherwise might have seen in this area. And maybe another way to see this is to go not to the total proportion of youth who use, but to start to look at interactions with other substances. In particular, I'll do this with tobacco. So what I want to contrast in these next slides, I realized I lied earlier. I told you there's only one hard slide for a morning, but the next two are hard too, I'm sorry. So I'm first going to show you the change over time in the total proportion of American youth using cannabis, and then I'm going to break it down and look amongst those who are smoking tobacco, what has happened, and amongst those who are not smoking tobacco, what has changed to cannabis use over time. All right, so this is just the simple totals contrasting 2003 and 2018. And the reason I use that time frame is that the survey wording changed a little bit between 2002 and 2003. So this is as far back as I can go and have the wording of the survey be exactly the same. And the basic punchline here is that prevalence overall hasn't changed much, and in fact, it's even a little bit lower. So it seems like things have gotten better for youth. But now I want to split all youth up into smokers and non-smokers. And if you look at it broken down like that, in the past, 42% of American youth who smoked tobacco also used cannabis, and that has gone up to 57%, sort of a 1/3 increase. And amongst youth who don't smoke tobacco, it used to be 3.2% use cannabis, and that has gone up to 5.2%, which is a 60% increase in the proportion amongst tobacco smokers. So we have what you learn in your statistics class is called a Simpson's paradox. Cannabis use is up for kids who smoke. Cannabis use is up for kids who don't smoke. But cannabis use overall is flat or maybe even went down because of the spectacular successes in the anti-smoking public health arena. So the progress in reducing tobacco use has camouflaged the increase in cannabis use in each of those different categories. All right, so I want to try to draw to a close because I don't want to take too much of Annalina's time. As very quickly mentioned, the fourth thing that I would have liked to have talked about is how having a cannabis industry changes the kinds of products that are out there in the marketplace. And my metaphor here is like milk and dairy products. In the last century, we had what in North America we called marijuana, cannabis that was smoked. That's like milk. It's just one thing. What we have now is an entire cannabis industry that makes a very wide range of products out of the cannabis plant, like having not just milk, but also cheese and yogurt and ice cream. And the industry makes those things out of extracts of the plant instead of just selling the flowering tops, because half of the cannabinoid molecules are in other parts of the plant. You can recover those after legalization because you can have an extraction machine. Looks sort of like the machine used to take caffeine out of coffee beans to make decaffeinated coffee. And then you can use the concentrated extracts to sell a whole range of other products. And I'll just show you a few pictures of the kinds of products that are being sold now in the United States. They're edibles, they're beverages, they're lotions, they're vaping pens, and there are lots of opportunities for bundling the cannabis product with other kinds of products because the cannabis itself becomes extremely inexpensive. So you can sell cannabis as a loss leader to hook people in and then make your money on other sorts of products. Quite literally, we're moving into a time when cannabis will be so cheap, there's no reason that a hotel could not comp you a joint on your pillow the same way they leave an after-dinner chocolate mint on your pillow. Or in the same way that bars give you free salted nuts to make you thirsty so that you drink more alcohol, a restaurant could give you free cannabis because it enhances appetite and they make the money back on the food sale. So the whole nature of the product space is changing rapidly once there's a for-profit industry involved. So let me try to wrap up because I don't want to get into Annalina's time. But if you want to sort of think about policy in a very simple picture, there's an entire spectrum of policies you can have on cannabis. And decriminalization is just one small step along the spectrum. What North America is now doing is making a leap from prohibition all the way over to a for-profit commercial industry model. And I think it's essentially an irreversible leap into the unknown. Once you create a multi-billion-dollar industry, and the Canadian industry market capitalization is $33 billion at this point, it's really hard to undo that. So this is an irreversible leap. And no nation had ever done this before Canada did last year. And Canada hasn't even fully made the leap yet. Edibles are only going to go on sale next month. So we don't know what's going to happen. There are people who are worriers and say it's better to keep your options open than your eyes closed, and you should move along the spectrum very gingerly, very deliberately, one step at a time. And then there are optimists, people who believe in human beings and our wisdom, and who say, may the bridges that I burn today light the way for a better tomorrow. I'm normally a very optimistic person. I love the next generation of youth. I love technological innovation. But in this particular case, I am concerned that the attitude in North America is a little bit like this character from Mad Magazine, which I don't know if you remember him or not, but he always wandered around saying, "What should I worry?" even as an anvil is falling down on his head. Well, I personally am very worried about a commercial legalization model. I am worried that in North America 25 years from now, we are going to look back and say, what were we thinking? Why did we think it was a good idea to create yet another multi-billion-dollar multinational industry that depends for its profits on selling a dependence-inducing intoxicant to daily and near daily users when half of that consumption is by people with a substance use disorder? I won't try to comment on the policy reform you guys are considering next week, but I do want to caution you that well-meaning reformers can start a path that goes someplace that I at least worry about. So I hope that you have the wisdom as you embrace this very important policy choice to understand that decriminalization and legalization are very different things, and that policy reform is not something that just happens once overnight, but it can be part of a large and ongoing story. I thank you for giving me the chance to tell you a little bit of the story from North America of late, and I would love the chance to engage with you further about it. Thank you.